Great. Thank you and welcome to everyone who is joining us for Business in the Community's International Women's Day Power Hour session, which we're hosting on Zoom, but also broadcasting live on LinkedIn. I'm Katie Neep, I'm Business in the Community's Gender Equality Campaign Director, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. What we ask is that you share your own insights and links to research, what works in the chat, either on Zoom or through LinkedIn, and that you send your questions through on either of those platforms. We're going to do everything that we can to get through as many questions as possible in the Q&A section of today's session. So please do keep sharing, keep sending in insights, be as interactive as possible. We really want this to be the beginning of a conversation and for us to all share what we know, what is working, and what you're seeing as some of maybe the sticky challenges currently. So, International Women's Day 2023 is all about embracing equity, and this session is true to that campaign call to action. Over the next hour, we're going to focus on flexible working, not a women's issue. Or is it? This time last year, we launched our Who Cares report, developed in partnership with Ipsos Mori. The report found that nearly 2 in 3 people in work believe that their current main job can be done flexibly. So why is it that that same report found that nearly 3 in 10 women have left or considered leaving a job due to a lack of flexibility, compared to just 17% of men? Whilst a third of people from a Black, Asian, mixed race or other ethnically diverse background have left or considered leaving a job due to a lack of flexibility, compared with around 1 in 5 white people. Within its 2023 Women in Work Index released this week, PwC highlights that an 18-year-old woman entering the workforce today will not see pay equality in her working lifetime. The index goes on to highlight that the motherhood penalty, that loss in lifetime earnings experienced by women raising children, has become the most significant driver of the gender pay gap, driving underemployment, a lack of progression, perpetuated by the unfair share of childcare that women undertake. If we're going to make work work for everyone, regardless of gender, we need the policies, programs, and cultures that have equity at their heart, which is why I'm really pleased that today I'm joined by a panel of experts who will discuss what it would take to accelerate change and ensure that flexible working works for all, mitigating against some of those current negative impacts, the stats that I've just shared, that part-time and flexible working can have on pay, progression, and power in the workplace. So without further ado, and to give us as much time as possible with the panel of experts, I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage Declan O'Gorman. Declan is Head of Enterprise Engineering at NatWest Group and a member of Business in the Community's Gender Equality Leadership Team. Declan oversees the bank's engineering practice, technical talent approaches, and common software assets, leading a community of 7,000 developers to embrace modern tools and methodologies. Declan is also passionate about seeking new ways to diversify, upskill, and excite people about roles in technology. He co-sponsors the NatWest Technology Gender Balance Initiatives, Women in Technology, Employee-Led Network, and STEM Code Club program, as well as sitting on Tech She Can Steering Committee and a number of industry awards panels. Then we have Dr. Holly Burkett, Senior Lecturer at University of Birmingham and co-director of the Equal Parenting Project, and a member of the Department for Management. Holly's research field is in careers and career transitions, and she's currently conducting research into parental leave policies, flexible working, and fathers in the workplace. Holly has extensive experience working with policymakers and business networks in the UK and beyond. Finally, we have Zaimel Azad, Senior Campaigns Officer at the Fawcett Society, leading on campaigns and supporting their movement of local activist groups to achieve change for women. Zaimel has co-authored Fawcett's Broken Ladders report on pay and progression of women of colour and has 10 years of experience of working in a variety of roles in the women's sector in the UK and in Pakistan, working on a range of issues from political participation to poverty and financial independence for women and girls. So I think you can all agree it's quite the expert panel that we have for you today. Firstly, I want to turn to you, Holly. From your research and the Working Dads Employer Awards, and feel free to kind of give a bit of an overview of exactly what those awards are, what are you seeing work within organisations to ensure that more men apply to work flexibly?
Thanks very much, Katie, and welcome to everyone today, and thank you for the invitation. I am a co-director of the Parenting Project, and we do a lot of research essentially looking at how we can encourage more parents of all genders to get more involved in caring in order to open up opportunities for women and more opportunities for all parents as well to get more involved in family life, work-life balance, etc. So we do a lot of work around this area, both qualitative and quantitative. We do different events, as Katie's suggested. So we have an annual survey that we do looking at flexible working and the future of work. We also have awards, which I might talk about in a little bit. But some of the things that we're finding as we do interviews with employees and managers across the UK over time, and we do the surveys, is some of the really important things that organisations are doing that are really making a difference are things like having role models and champions within organisations, particularly role models and champions at all different levels, championing all different types of flexible working in organisations, to try and get away from that idea that flexible working is a women's issue. So men are fathers that are working flexibly in different ways, particularly in ways that we might not expect. So often we find that men, when they work flexibly, will work compressed hours, maybe some flexi time, but particularly case studies where there might be job shares that senior men in the organisation are doing, things like that can be really, really powerful for encouraging other men in the workplace to think, oh, this might be something that actually is acceptable here. And specific communications generally, particularly directed at men based on our research. So what we find throughout our research is men face a huge number of barriers on top of the barriers that everyone else faces in terms of using, getting access to, and then actually utilising flexible working. And some of those are around things like stigma and concerns about career progression, etc. Even in organisations where they have amazing policies, you often find that take-up can be quite low, and that can even be down to very specific cultures within particular functions that the particular individuals working within an organisation, as well as the broader culture of the organisation and societal norms as well, which we all know societal norms around caring and often flexibility at work can be very, very gendered, and that is a huge barrier that men face. So really some of the key things are role models and championing at all levels with different types of flexible working and communication specifically directed at men.
Brilliant. And are you able to expand a little bit on why you think it's so important to have a focus around making this more accessible to men, or to getting more men to access flexible working?
Yeah, I think what you find essentially, I think a lot of it comes down to these gendered cultural norms around caring, that they're seen, that caring is seen as a women's issue culturally across society, but often then that is mirrored across organisations as well. So in order to break that down, we need to try and work towards making flexible working something that is actively open to everyone and break down the different barriers that different groups might be facing in terms of access. And I think it's only through doing that that it becomes part of business as usual, and that you start to break down any stigma around taking it and around accessing it, ways of working while you're working flexibly, returning to other types of work, etc. So really, if we're going to get away from thinking of flexible working or flexible working being seen as a women's issue, we really need to think of specific ways to encourage others to work flexibly and support them to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Holly. So Declan, I guess I'd really like to hear from you as somebody inside a business, a large employer here in the UK. The past 3 years have seen where, when, and how we work brought into that public conversation and indeed kind of reality. Could you outline some of the changes that you've seen in NatWest, where you believe you're going on a flexible working journey? And in short, what do you think works and where do you see that focus going forward?
Absolutely. And hello, everybody. Firstly, a huge pleasure to be part of the panel today. Great to have this conversation and to learn from my co-panelists. I think we've seen a huge shift, one that would have maybe taken a decade for us to get to had we not had, clearly an unfortunate accelerant, but one that feels like it's left a long-lasting change to the way that we think about and conduct our work. We've been catapulted into homeschooling, into taking time off, into really forcing us to consider the consequences of our work patterns, personal well-being, mental well-being, in a way that I think we probably didn't, frankly, really before 2020. The consequence of that has been, I think, a sustained conversation in the workplace around how we do work, when we do work, what work we do, and has led to a degree of conflation, I think, around remote working, hybrid working, and true flexible working. So I think we've seen a huge increase in appetite around flexible and remote working and the ability for us to really engage a workforce, as I am today at home, in a way that we probably didn't properly do before. But equally, there's a danger that to some degree masks the conversation of proper flexibility in a working environment. I was lucky enough to have 6 months off when I had my first child, to do partnership and sort of parenting that together. Lots of nappy changing involved, much less relaxing than I thought it would be. And I have a wife who works a sort of school-time contract, works part-time at the moment, so luckily is able to do pickups and drop-offs. But I think that conversation about how we set ourselves up as a workforce and a workplace to really encourage and embrace the different needs and the equity of our teams, both male and female, is a critical enabler. We recognise as employers that we're fundamentally in a talent war. Most of what I do is about how we get the right people, the right skills, the right ideas into an organisation where fundamentally the customers that we're serving, the tens of millions of NatWest and RBS and Coots customers out there in the organisations in the UK, are dealing with these life situations that we need our staff to equally have empathy with and understand as well. So I think there's a lot more we need to do to recognise and move into a true flexible working conversation. At NatWest specifically, I think we've gone through the sort of conversation about the value of this, how we see it as a critical need, an enabler for us to go and, as I said, tap into that talent market and retain and provide the right purpose and support around the colleagues that we've already got. I think Holly absolutely covered the role modelling conversation really well, and both for female and male role models at senior and junior grades, giving people a true sense of actually this is happening, this person has done it, why can't I? An opportunity to connect, have listening sessions and understand the journey that they went on, I think is incredibly powerful, and we've had some really positive feedback on internally. We've done a lot of work to increase the autonomy that line managers have, to help them really not feel like they have to stick to the letter of the law in a policy document somewhere, but really empathise and understand with the needs of their team and really work out how we can best meet their flexibility requirements. And lastly, we've also then started to sort of embed this into our internal policy. So all of the job ads that you see on NatWest, or the vast majority of them at least, have a standardized tagline at the top that says, this job can be done flexibly. Please come and talk to us about what that might look like for you. And not trying to pigeonhole it into this is a job shared job, this is a part-time job, but actually let's fit it around your needs rather than try and cookie cutter it. And lastly, we were talking about before we started, but equal partner leave. So for me now, if I was having another child, which wasn't there at the time I did, but the ability for both parents to take time off and not see it as a need to choose one over the other to be that carer, which I think also from an employer's perspective means that we're not setting ourselves up with stereotypes and norms about expecting one gender but over another to be likely to take time away from the workplace.
Thank you, Declan. That's a really kind of covers, I think, both the kind of policy and embedding it in things like job adverts, but also some of the culture work, that role modelling again, and some of your personal experience. So thank you so much for sharing. I think everyone will agree it's quite interesting to hear how, as a large organisation, you're starting to look at that journey and really embed both some of the policies and practices, but also some of that culture. Zamal, I talked a bit at the beginning about our Who Cares report and some of the data that revealed around a third of people from Black, Asian, mixed race and other ethnically diverse backgrounds having left or considered leaving a job due to a lack of flexibility, compared to just 1 in 5 white people. I know that your Broken Ladders report, which you were, key to implementing, found some similar trends around progression. And I just wondered if you could share some of those insights with everyone who's listening in today, and importantly, what you think employers can do to mitigate them.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here, and it was really interesting hearing from Holly and Declan as well, especially about, I guess, how that cultural change actually happens in organizations, and I think very relevant to the work that we've done with Broken Ladders, which is a research piece that we did with the Runnymede Trust, looking at the experiences of women of color in the workplace, and it really sort of the motivation behind that was the fact that women of color are pretty much missing from top positions in institutions across the country, whether you look at the civil service, or you look at FTSE 100 companies, or you look at higher education. There are actually 0 women of colors in the top positions, and we are seeing that that's something that's not changing for the better. So we spoke to over 2,000 women of color from across sectors in organizations of different sizes, and what we found was overwhelming evidence that institutional barriers are holding women of color back, as well as organizational cultures. So we're seeing environments that are very much white middle class, and women of color are having to change who they are in order to try and fit in. So 75% of women of color that we spoke to said that they'd experienced some kind of racism in the workplace. And that included over a quarter having experienced explicit racial slurs. So, really kind of really shocking, but actually not unfamiliar to women of color if you speak to them. And I think it's really relevant to this conversation, because a lot of these barriers and that hold people from minoritized backgrounds in other ways are also what hold them back, I think, from being able to access flexible work, because it's about those environments which are not facilitating them to be who they are, to access what they need. One of the things that came out quite strongly was the idea of barrier bosses. So women of color talked to us about managers holding them back, sort of, stopping progression. And when not in that proactive way, not providing that support. And so when we're talking about flexibility and the role of managers and organizations, I think it's really important that we have that mix of both informal settings, but also be really mindful of what that can mean for people who might not be able to have those conversations or those relationships with their managers where they feel like they will be listened to. So those formal routes are really important as well. I think the caring responsibilities element is really important to talk about as well. And one of the things that we found was that women of color are actually leaving employment to either go into self-employment or out of the workforce altogether because of that lack of flexibility. This was also corroborated by our recent polling, which showed that over a third of women want to work more hours but aren't able to do so, either because their employers aren't offering that flexibility or because of their caring responsibilities and lack of childcare options. And this is significantly worse for women of color. So I think it's about 34% for women in general, but 43% for women of color. So it really, exactly what you find in your report, Katie, I think is what we're seeing. But there are things employers can do. And I think, like Declan talked about, it's both small steps that lead to that cultural change as well. We're calling on employers to have anti-racism action plans that have specific targets that are monitored and reported on regularly. Jobs to be advertised as flexible is a really key action, because women of color, and this again, I think this speaks to that difference, and this is probably, I think it'll be true for people from minoritized backgrounds in general, but we were looking specifically at women of color. And it's that lack of comfort in being able to have that conversation. If you're already sort of on the back foot because of how that culture is, how your previous experiences are, it's very hard to have that conversation at an interview about what your flexibility needs might be. And if a job is advertised as flexible, that's a really simple thing that can make a huge difference in attracting a diverse workforce. And for managers to be given the right training and the right tools to be able to do that. So managers need to be empowered to be, to take action, to be able to support them, and to have the kind of both the structures, but also the training and I guess the leadership to make that change happen. So we've got a whole set of if you look at the full report, it actually provides specific actions against each of those areas that I won't go into, but there's a ready-made action plan in tackling racism and trying to remove some of those barriers that women from minoritized backgrounds are facing in their workplaces.
Thank you, Zaimal. Some really sobering statistics, I think, for all of us to kind of consider and think about, and really to look at that intersectionality. But interesting, as you say, some of the actions that both your report recommends, but also we're seeing work in the sense of that role modeling, in the sense of working with line managers and advertising, is it taking away, I guess, the responsibility for it always being the individual who has to ask, as opposed to being very loud and proud and open about the potential of flexible working, so that it feels like it's a conversation that can be had, as opposed to another hurdle to kind of overcome. So I think great to hear some of those recommendations, and what I will ask kindly, if one of the BIC team can put in the chat a link to the Broken Ladders report, but also we'll send it out as a follow-up, because there are some really great recommendations that come out. Now I can see that a couple of questions are coming through, so please do keep sending them. Use the Zoom link, use LinkedIn. We will kind of share them across both platforms so that everybody can have sight of them, but do keep thinking of your questions before we move to the formal session. Many thanks, Amelia, for putting that link in there. So before we move into the kind of open Q&A session, I'd like to probe, and Zaimal, I think actually you touched on it a little bit within your response, just around one of the things that we hear often from employers, and this is to the whole panel, is that they have an informal approach to flexible working. And without making it sound like, because I don't believe this at all, that informal flexible working is a bad thing, do you think there are any risk or opportunities around formal versus informal, and how do employers maybe strike that balance? So Declan, I wonder if I could come to you first on this one.
Absolutely, and I think that Zaimal covered it really well. I think we touched on it earlier as well. For us, this is about the combination of equity and equality in this space. So having the policies that give your line managers confidence and comfort that they know what's there to offer, but equally recognizing that the needs of every individual are going to be slightly different. And as we said earlier, trying to cookie cutter somebody into a job share or a part-time role or a term time role, etc. Ultimately the conversation needs to be had on what the best solution for that individual is. And the line managers need to feel that they've got a degree of flexibility, autonomy, and accountability, really, to make sure that that works effectively. I think that point around line manager training and consistency of how that gets rolled out becomes incredibly important, especially as an organisation scales. Ultimately, your line managers are the face of that conversation to the vast majority of people who are going to hear it. And for us, that's been about rolling out Choose to Challenge sessions. It's been rolling out awareness and equity sessions. It's been rolling out understandings on the sort of line manager professionalism and sort of policy side of things. Ultimately, I don't think we're ever going to get that right across every individual in an organisation of scale. But really, it's about sort of entering that point. I think just two things to pick up, really. There is a perception as we start to become more flexible around how we cope with flexible working, that actually the way we report on flexible working starts to become a bit more challenging. The number of formal requests potentially starts to go down, but actually the level of flexibility we offer goes up. And so I think there's a bit of a careful what we measure and goal against in this space as well. We've talked a bit about profiling and role modeling this. I think where we've got to in NatWest is a good example, just taking from one of our recent surveys. My manager helps me adapt to change my business function and what they mean for my job. We're 10% above the rest of the finance industry on that one. And my work pattern allows sufficient flexibility to meet my needs. 93% of our employees strongly agree with that statement. So I think that the model is working, but clearly requires continued care, and awareness, really.
Great. Same, Al, I wonder if you've got any kind of further points you want to expand on or respond in terms of what Declan has just said.
Yeah, I think Declan's said it really. I think the monitoring bit is quite important in seeing how I think in looking at who's accessing that flexible work as well. So what that data looks like, who feels able to do it, and that would be really useful for organizations, both in terms of, I guess, the gender balance of that, as well as looking at other people who might not be accessing it to the same way or to the same degree, and why that might be. I think that mix is really important, because some informality, some flexibility within that is so important, because if you've just got the set structures, that's not necessarily going to work for everybody. So there are so many opportunities for that informal model, but just by itself it isn't enough. And I think that's really important to emphasize, that it does need to be a mix. There need to be the formal policies and structures in place, and then I think they can be improved by managers being empowered to offer greater flexibility where needed.
Great. Holly, I know that you've been doing quite a lot of research around that's looking at line managers' perceptions and how they've changed over the kind of COVID years and out of COVID years, wherever we are, never out of COVID, but away from the pandemic years. I wonder if you've got any further reflections on this kind of informal, formal balance based on what you've heard.
Yeah, really echoing quite a lot of what Declan and Zomal have already said. I mean, we really find that through all our research that line managers, as we all know, can be the most significant facilitators of good quality flexible working, and they can be the most significant barriers as well. So I think throughout our research, one of the things that really concerns us, and I think it's the balance between, there's a difference between informality and flexibility. And what we find quite concerning with the research we're doing at the moment, looking at what organisations are doing, in the longitudinal research we've been doing at looking at flexible working and the future of work over the last 3 years, we've seen a real move to managers having their employees working flexibly but informally. And that is quite concerning for us, because what often informal flexible working often equates to insecure flexible working, because essentially what it means is that you often can't bank on being able to work flexibly longer term. So you'll always be thinking, well, if my line manager changes, for example, which we know turnover, there's always a likelihood that could happen. What does that then mean? So I think, and I think that is really problematic. What we're talking about women here in terms of International Women's Day, because I think if you're trying to plan your caring responsibilities and what you're doing, you want a degree of security or certainty that there'll be some flexibility around your flexible working on an ongoing basis. Yes, you probably you're likely to want some flexibility on that. For example, say you're moving from your children being at nursery to school, you might go from wanting to drop off or pick up at one time to a different time, or needing to condense hours because of different responsibilities on different days. So you potentially need some kind of flexibility. But I think the problem with informal approaches that a lot of organisations are taking is that you can't plan for any kind of certainty. You might end up, even in an organisation that is doing great things, has great policies and has a broader culture supporting all kinds of flexible working, we've all been there. different line managers operate in slightly different ways, and the ways they work are affected by the culture, but if you're being managed by a particular individual, the ways they've worked, the cultures that they've worked in throughout their careers often affect the way that they manage. So we would very much advocate for flexible but formalised forms of flexible working, rather than an approach which is just informal's better for everyone because there's more flexibility and we can change.
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting to hear the kind of spectrum of experiences, and also that, you know, let's be honest, this is a process that we're all navigating, that as Declan, you quite rightly pointed out, was kind of accelerated with the pandemic, with a need for change. And we're now all trying to work out, okay, how do we actually make this balance and work most effectively, and ensure that we aren't creating barriers, or we aren't creating a system that only works for a certain cohort of people. So I think it's really interesting to have differences of kind of what we're seeing and what we may advocate for. I guess on that theme and some of the questions that are coming through, I'm going to move to questions now from the wider audience and maybe come back to a question in the sum up. But I just wanted to pull, I guess, on that thread of the theme around kind of cultures and presenteeism. So a question has come in around mandated office attendance. So I think when we're talking in this space around flexible working, obviously hybrid, how many days you should be in the office, how many days you can work from home, what that looks like. What do you think as a panel about that mandated office attendance in a hybrid working environment? And there's some discussion in the chat about what individuals may do, but yeah, where are we sort of falling out on that? So I'll start with Zaimal this time.
Thank you. That's it's very much a question of the times, isn't it? I think anything that's mandated, especially in terms of this, ends up, you need to think about why you might be doing something like that, right? I think organizations, when they're talking about being in the office or not, I think they should be thinking really hard about why, what the reason for that is, what's the motivation behind it is. I can understand wanting to have kind of the team in one place regularly, but that doesn't necessarily have to equate to mandated office attendance, and that wouldn't work for a lot of people, and that could actually make that flexibility quite impractical to actually to put in place, because what are those days, how does that work, what does that then mean for people who actually might not be living within that area? What might that mean to people with school pickups, with caring responsibilities of actually not just children, but sort of older parents, or like hospital appointments, just so many reasons. I think we've been talking a lot about gender and race, but actually for disabled people, flexibility offers huge opportunities and benefits. I think TUC recently did some research that had something like 9 in 10 disabled people would be able to work because if their employer offered flexibility. So and if you've got then mandated office attendance, that can start to negate some of those benefits. But I think employers really need to think about what that is and the motivations behind that and how to facilitate what they might be trying to achieve, because it's that culture of presenteeism, I think, that's often where that's coming from rather than an actual need.
Great. Holly, I wonder if you have anything else here kind of on the hybrid, the return to the office. We are seeing, I guess, more organisations mandating kind of certain number of days. Yeah, any insights or thoughts?
There's a couple of things. One is I do get concerned by the number of organisations we talk to where they are mandating certain days in the office, and it's often because we just built a new building before COVID and we need to make sure it's being used, or because our CEO or one of the people on the board doesn't like seeing or empty offices or wants people to be there when they want something. I think it is very much, and I think this brings in the kind of conversation to me that I think is quite important around performance management. One of the things that we see is huge numbers of organisations, because of everything that's already been said with the changes during COVID and changes of working, and people trying to kind of build on that for the future in terms of all for talent, recruitment, retention, etc. They are changing policies, so a lot of organisations are really thinking about their flexible working policies. But what is quite surprising, or maybe it isn't surprising, is how few of those are actually then reviewing their performance management systems as well, to ensure that, I think Declan talked about embedding flexible working before, and I would have thought that was one key way you embed it, because performance management systems show what you actually value in an organisation, and can have unintended consequences in relation to some of the things you might be doing around culture. And I think it all really comes back to this, is what are you trying to achieve with the organisation, and trying to drive your performance management process around that. And then for me, that then more naturally leads to people coming in when they need to come in for things that you're trying to achieve as the organisation. So it's much more understandable for me when I speak to organisations and they might say, oh, we try and get everyone in on a Wednesday because we do a lot of group activities, we do a lot of sort of bonding, networking, we do sessions where we get people being creative and thinking of new ideas together and bouncing off each other. That makes a lot of sense to me if that's part of what you're trying to achieve as for your organisation to move forward. Having people in because you need to fill the office space, or because there's senior people on the board that are concerned that offices look empty, doesn't make so much sense from my point of view. But obviously I totally understand that in different industries there's potentially different needs around that.
Yeah. Declan, I wonder if you're open to kind of share NatWest and yeah, your experience.
I think both Holly and Simon have touched on the main thing, focusing on why. I think is really important, and it's not where you're working, but what work you're doing that matters. I think we've got through the you can't be productive at home debates. Actually, there's a lot of data to suggest you can be more productive at home for certain types of work or roles. I think there are a couple of just very quick things. So firstly, I think we have a bit of proximity bias sometimes in these conversations towards office working cultures. And actually there are a lot of people potentially on this call or out there in the UK industry who are going to be frontline workers in a branch in NatWest, for example, or in a shop on a rota, where in reality some of the flexibility or ability to work remotely at home, etc., may not be there in the same way. I think what we're finding though is ultimately there's a degree of let's understand why coming together matters. I've had a very recent conversation with my team where the discussion was, well, the rest of my team are in India, so why should I bother coming into the office in Edinburgh? And actually the sort of thing that's being lost there is that broader connection with the company, the cultural norming, the ability to create networks, coach and mentor, find next career opportunities elsewhere in an organization, build trust, all of those things that I think we were very used to when we came into the workplace, that probably those who've entered roles over the last few years have had a lot less of, especially in our graduate and intern type populations. So I think we just need to bring the conversation back, exactly as Holly said, not to the building's empty, but the value of coming together is brainstorming, getting around a whiteboard, having an informal tea and coffee, and building a deeper sense of who am I, not what work am I doing. I think the last thing I'd say is, we found a lot of success with allowing teams within a framework. So you must be in a minimum of this many days a month, on average this many days a month. Now you decide in your own charter, which day do you prefer to come in as a team? All try and come in that day if you can, but hell, if you can't, doesn't matter. How often are you going to be in? Up to you. What type of work do you do? And really there's a degree of trust and autonomy and agency that I think we can really sort of bed into an organization.
Great. So I think that's really interesting, that idea of kind of the why, the purpose, but also that co-designing that charter, how you want to work as a team, and what the impact is going to be of you going into an office or working from home, and how you kind of co-design that as a team, which leads me to another question that we've had in around a certain theme. So, and I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to name the phrase because it's a buzz phrase that's out there. How do we ensure that organizations, employers think about job design? So doing jobs differently rather than just flexibility, and what potential would that have? So I think we've touched on this a bit in the sense of, you know, instead of putting the onus on the employee to have that conversation, looking maybe more at outputs rather than kind of hours work or sat in an office. How do we shift that conversation to job design and thinking about doing jobs differently? And what potential do you think that has? Holly, maybe I'll start with you this time.
In my view, and I think Declan made a very good point about we do often in these kind of conversations focus on some of the kind of examples from office-based work, but I think because this is something that's kind of was always an issue and always came up before COVID as well. I think one of the things with flexible working is we need to get away from just thinking about things like flexi time or compressed hours or working from home and working remotely, and try and think even with roles that are more frontline facing, to think of how so the starting point is, how can this job be done flexibly? So rather than the starting point is it possible to do this job flexibly? The assumption is, right, everything's possible to do flexibly in some way. Yes, there are certainly jobs that cannot be done part-time or cannot be done in totally flexible hours, etc. But if we start off with an assumption that all jobs could be potentially done flexibly in some way, as a default, and then there may be a few that there is no way of introducing any type of flexibility. And I think it's quite hard to think of too many where there's no way of encouraging any kind of flexibility. And just get to sort of that mindset, because I think we're still at a mindset where it's like we need to show how it can be done flexibly, rather than taking it from the other side of, right, most jobs probably can be done flexibly in some way. Let's think about how this could possibly be done flexibly. And let's actually consult people doing those jobs in terms of how they can be done flexibly, rather than, it necessarily being something that's just considered by a group of senior managers in a boardroom, to kind of try and think out the box a little bit about how different roles maybe could be done flexibly.
Great. Declan, I saw you kind of lean in a bit there. I wonder if you have any kind of reflections, job design, and some of that point around co-designing.
I, as always, agree with everything Holly said. I think she's spot on, and really starting with that question of what would it take to do this flexibly, but really with the why is this role here? Or what's it trying to achieve? And it's not here to do it 9 to 5. It's here to achieve an outcome for a customer or a colleague. And actually, does it matter if that's done at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or at 2 o'clock the next morning, whatever it might be? I think we've become very good at global role design, taking advantage of time zones in others to allow our staff base to flex how they serve customers in different ways. I don't think we're very good at it locally. I did just want to sort of touch on, I think, myopically, a lot of the conversation I've been having around how technology will help change the way that we think of the jobs that we do, hopefully over the next sort of decade or so that we're heading into. We spent a lot of time doing manual processes, repetitive manual processes as organizations over the last several decades. We're now at a point where technology is coming along and I think starting to fundamentally change the way that we engage with the work that we do. So automating a lot of that simplistic, repetitive, predictable work out of our daily job, and in large part elevating a lot of us into sort of knowledge worker categories, really allowing us to hopefully have a slightly more purposeful and fulfilling job with that, but equally one that probably implicitly therefore has a higher degree of flexibility. I think finally, just to Holly's point, we hit a pandemic a few years ago, and all of those jobs that we didn't think we could do flexibly suddenly were done flexibly. So our call centers, where you had to be in a building to answer the phone, suddenly people were taking calls from home. Answering an email or a tweet from somebody, actually the customer doesn't care if that really happened between 9 to 5 during the working day. There's a huge opportunity for us to think much more holistically about the benefits that it provides our organizations to embrace a different type of way of working and a different way of serving customers.
Great, thank you. Zaimal, I wonder if you have any further reflections or contributions you want to make on that. But I also wanted to bring in, there was a point raised, I think it's through LinkedIn, but it's been kind of shared on the Zoom chat here around I guess, perception. So the contributor sort of asking, often an experience where Black women are sort of saying to them that they feel they're seen as aggressive when they're trying to raise a point or make a request. What do you think can be done? Why do you think this barrier exists? And I wonder if there's anything more from kind of Broken Ladders and the work that you've been doing that we can share on that specific point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first on job design, I think that why that Declan talked about it is really important, but I wonder if we can also extend that to not just how the job is designed in terms of doing it, but also who we're expecting to do it. So a lot of job descriptions are quite, for example, rigid in terms of the requirements, but actually it should be about, it shouldn't necessarily always, like, qualification isn't necessarily a substitute for, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do that job well. So really thinking about what the job is for, what you're trying to achieve, and how and who that can be achieved in the best way, and involving people within those conversations and reviewing that regularly as well. If a job's always being done a certain way, that doesn't mean it always has to be done that way. I think it's really important. I think on the second point, it's, that's absolutely one of the things that we saw so much of in the research, and in terms of the stereotypes that exist about certain groups of people. So one of the things we did with Broken Ladders was really broke down that category of women of color. I've not gone into that today much just because of time, but we looked at the experiences of, Black women separately from maybe South Asian women, and even within that we looked at the experiences of Black women from African heritage as compared to experiences of Black women with Caribbean heritage, and so on, because while there's a lot of commonality of experience, there are those differences as well, and it's really important to recognize that. So some of those stereotypes about Black women being perceived as aggressive if they just try to make a point or actually trying to ask for something. And that's where those formal processes can be really important, because when so many women spoke to us about this, about how when you're trying to raise a point or when you're trying to kind of make a case for yourself, if you're a Black woman, you're seen as problematic or creating an issue, or being seen as targeting somebody, when all you're doing is just trying to make a case for yourself. On the opposite side of that, we saw a sort of Muslim women talking about how they were perceived as really submissive, and like they're, like they couldn't be leaders or they couldn't be managers. And this is where I think when we talk a lot about, I think especially over the past few years, when after the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of organizations are trying to do anti-racism training, really thinking about how they do this work. It's so important that training is meaningful, that it involves the people who are affected by it, but also compensates them for that time. And if you're asking people of color to do the education, to think about how they're being compensated, but to really look at those differences and those stereotypes, and to create spaces where these conversations can be had. And leadership is really, really key in that. I think this is sometimes so difficult to talk about, or is perceived to be difficult to talk about, that people don't want to have these conversations in the workplace, but that modeling by leadership of some of these conversations, looking at exploring those stereotypes, looking at what that means, how that might be playing out in your workplace, is really important.
Thank you for that. And I hope, if nothing else, one of the things that we take from today is that this should be about accelerating some of those difficult conversations, and hopefully you've got some ideas of the tools and the things that are working within that. But I would ask everyone who's joined this to really think about how can you accelerate some of those difficult conversations and ensure that we are, in the context of today's conversation, representing and looking at all women as we move forward. So I'm conscious of time, and I'm very keen to make sure that I chair us to a power hour, not a power hour and 5 minutes. So I think final sort of question for me, one of the things that has come through on my sort of chat feed is top tips for any individual who is on this call, or maybe who is listening back, who is sat there thinking, I've got a challenging caring responsibility, or I've got a real need for flexibility, but I don't know how to ask for that flexibility, or what perhaps I might be able to look for. What top tips would you give an individual to start that conversation? What things should they be looking out for? Declan, I wonder if I could come to you on that one first.
Of course. Sorry. I think the first thing is to recognise your value as an individual in that conversation. And actually this is you, who the organisation has invested a massive amount of time and energy in. You are a great asset for them. So actually, going into this conversation with a recognition that actually, in general, they're going to try and support you. It is sometimes a bit of a daunting conversation, completely recognise that, but actually there's a degree of sort of going in with a sense of self-value and self-worth for that conversation. I think that's really important. Reading up on your organisation's policies, I think, is incredibly important, understanding what's out there, and really just sort of rehearsing the conversation. If you're unsure, find a friend, find a family member, and just go through it in draft first.
Same, Al, I wonder if there's anything from the conversations and the work that you've been doing that you would kind of give as a top tip on this one.
Yeah, and again, I think, like we've said, throughout the conversation, that the responsibility needs to shift, but we know that's not always the case. I think understanding what your rights are within that as well, both within the organizational space, but legally, the law is shifting on that as well, and that responsibility is shifting. So I think with the new kind of legislative change coming in, employers should really be accepting requests for flexible working unless there's unless they can find a strong business case for it. And more often than not, they should be able to do that, and that's not something that employers will be asked to take the view of trying to make it work rather than trying to make it not work. So I think understanding some of that and really being confident within that, I think you know best what your job is and how you do it and what works for you, and that's what really helps you make the case. Because if you're talking to a manager, for example, again, you know better than anybody how to do that job, and you've been doing it. So I think it's remembering that, and maybe talking to other people in the organization who work flexibly as well to see how they went about it, because that kind of peer support can be really, really great as a way of both building your confidence and knowing what works within the context of your organization.
Great. So I think we're collecting here, kind of know your rights, recognize your value, look for those role models, test and rehearse what you're going to say. Holly, anything else to add on these kind of top tips?
I don't want to repeat any of the great stuff that's already been said, which was really useful. The other thing is, so we have the Equal Parenting Project website, and we've got a lot of research and a lot of evidence about why flexible working and family-friendly policies are helpful for organisations and things around business cases and all sorts of things. So I'll put the link up to that as well, because it can be quite useful to actually kind of arm yourself with some reasoning when you go and speak to your line manager or more senior people in the company, to actually encourage them to sort of say, this other organizations are doing this is why it's so effective, this will help you with your recruitment, retention, and kind of go on with some kind of facts and information that might help you make your case. But I completely agree with what's already been said, is really we want to encourage the onus to be on the organisation to have open conversations, grown-up conversations about, right, this is the needs of the company, these are what we're trying to achieve, these are your needs, we want to work together, how can we, it might not be exactly what you want, but how can we come up with something that can work for both sides, and make your role, work for your work-life balance and work for the organisation going forward.
Great. Thank you, panel. I'm going to draw us to a kind of formal close for that, and ask very kindly if Florence just puts up the final slide. But first and foremost, I'd like to say a huge thank you, Declan, Holly, Zaimel. I think we'll all agree. I'm going to give you a round of applause that everyone would see, but I'm sure everybody is joining in at home. You have been a fantastic panel. Really, really interesting insights and lots of food for thought, I think, from me to take home, and hopefully everyone who's listening live, but also who may be listening back to this. So just really to summarise, finalise today's Power Hour session, how else can business in the community help you take action now? It would be remiss of me not to kind of use the final moments to say, if you don't know who business in the community is, we are a membership organisation. We work with large employers to help kind of further the responsible business journey on everything from the environment through to gender equality, as we've been talking about today. And we have a number of ways, specifically as this slide talks about, that we can support you around gender. So we have advisory services teams who may be able to help you with line manager training, to look at some of your policies, and whatever you need really to understand what change is working and to really embed that within your organisation. We've got content coming out of our ears, and I'm really pleased Holly's been sharing some of the work that her and the team have been doing, and we'll make sure all of the links are sent round. But launched this week and talked about in this webinar was the Equal Parental Leave Toolkit. So for all organisations wondering, can we ladder up to that? Yes, you can. And Declan and NatWest are testament to that. So have a look at that, look at the case study. We have case studies, we have future events like this covering the full spectrum of gender equality. And as I say, we really do want you to join us and help us be a network for change, because the UN General Secretary announced this year that globally we are 300 years away from gender equality. That is 3 centuries. And I really, really would like us to accelerate that and it to not be 300 years away. So there are so many ways you can do that. We are one of the ways that you can help be that movement for change. And I really, really do hope that you join us, that you look at your own policies, and that you help us advocate and agitate for change. My final thanks is going to the team. The team in the background that has made this all work. I definitely had nothing to do with the platform or the organisation. So Florence, Amelia, Emily, Finn, you are all marvellous, and thank you for bringing us our first ever LinkedIn Live, and thank you for everybody who's attended. Huge thanks for taking part in the chat. Do apply for the Working Dads Employer Awards. They are fantastic and really great to be building that insight. And as we've said throughout today, without those role models, without those examples, we won't be able to accelerate that change. So thank you. I think I've even given you 2 minutes back, maybe. That's amazing chairing. So happy International Women's Day. Go forth, accelerate. Let's not leave it 3 centuries. And as that slide says, work it faster, braver, bolder. Many thanks. Thanks, panel. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.